Thank you, Chairman Herzog. You introduced us in a very deep way immediately into the subject matter of this afternoon, and I invite the panelists this afternoon. Please join me on the podium. Before introducing all the speakers, let me explain that the EU adopted early December 2018 a very comprehensive document. We copied some, we left copies outside. I don't know if you took them. Certainly you didn't have time to read it, but this is a very important and a milestone document by the EU on the whole question of anti-Semitism, and it's very important, and it will be the subject this afternoon, certainly in this panel. Already the speakers mentioned that you are here, Katharina von Schnurbien, the EU Commission Coordinator on Combating Anti-Semitism. I would like to express, first of all, our sincere thanks for your personal efforts. My friends in Brussels tell me that without these efforts, without your persistence, and it took several years to get this document adopted by the Council. The Council of Ministers is the highest body in the EU. And as I said, it was adopted on the 6th of December 2018. And so we very much grateful for your contribution and for willing to come all the way from Brussels. At least we give you a warmer reception and climate than you have in Brussels. The second speaker will be the Austrian ambassador to Israel, Dr. Martin Wiess. I think it's coincidence that all the ambassadors around this table are doctors as well. Coincidence. You were already, before coming to Israel, you met a small Israeli community when you were Consul General in Los Angeles, I believe. And once again, member states of the EU are very important, and there is a rotation of presidents of the Council. Every 6 months, another member state becomes the president of the Council, and Austria was in the presidency in the second half of 2018, and that is when this declaration was adopted. And once again, my friends in Brussels tell me that without the efforts and pushing of Austria as the president of the Council, this would not have passed. So thanks to you and to your country. Dina Porat, Professor Dina Porat from the Tel Aviv University, is a worldly renowned scholar on today's subject. You are also the head of the Kantor Center in the Tel Aviv University. Moshe Kantor is the president of the European Jewish Congress, which is affiliated with the World Jewish Congress, and a very important figure in this issue of combating anti-Semitism in Europe. You are also the chief historian of Yad Vashem, a very important position. And the last speaker will be Emmanuele, Giaufret, my friend. This is the second term Tel Aviv. If I may joke, you will continue to stay in Israel and maybe be here for the third time until the EU decides that Israel behaves correctly. So these are the speakers, and I will be unfair a bit because, Katharina, you will get 10 minutes to as a starting comment. The others will get only 5 minutes, but this is because you traveled all the way from Brussels. So, please.
So, thank you very much, Oded, for the kind welcome. Thanks to the INSS, to the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung and the IASEI for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. And I will give you a short overview over basically what happened over the last year in 2018, which I think was really an important year with regards to the fight against anti-Semitism in Europe. Maybe just one clarification. So the declaration that you mentioned was indeed initiated and negotiated by the Austrian presidency. So while we had a lot of preparation for it, but the actual text and the whole process was started and also finished within a half year, the second half of 2018. So as we know, in 2018, and that continues into this year, anti-Semitic incidents in Europe are spiking. It's a very worrying development, and many statements have been made and are being made as we see new horrific incidents almost every day, and it's, I think, an unprecedented situation since the Second World War. I think this was probably unthinkable 10 years ago, the way the chutzpah with which people go out and make anti-Semitic statements, and I fully agree that part of the reason for it is the social media and the floodgates that have been opened by a boundarless and also, in a way, unregulated highway of information. We have been very clear, and I think this is being expressed also by the declaration, that anti-Semitism is not a problem of the Jews. It's a problem of the anti-Semites, but it's above all also a responsibility by the political institutions of the EU on all levels and the general society to counter it. And that has been the approach with regards to the declaration. If we look into the research that we have done, the survey that we did in 2018 with the Fundamental Rights Agency, where we polled 16,300 Jews across Europe about their perception of anti-Semitism, we see that 1 in 5 says that over the past year, a family member or a friend has been harassed either orally or physically, which is a record high number. And 1 in 3 Jews avoids visiting Jewish events from time to time because they don't feel safe to go there. And the fact, I think, when you don't feel safe, in such an environment, I think this is when you start thinking, is this still my place? Is this still my home? And 40% in this survey said that they have thought about leaving over the past year. Of course, not all of them go. In fact, 1 to 2% go, but still it's the first time after the Second World War, since 2014, now that we see the Jewish community in overall figures in Europe declining. And that's very worrying. And when you ask people why they go, especially when it's about making Aliyah, and you say, well, it's not so easy for Europeans sometimes to live in Israel either, they say, yes, but the state is on my side. And I think this is key when it comes to ensuring a future for Jews in Europe. That we were very clear, and I think the most important message of the declaration is not written in the declaration. It's the message, Europe is on the side of the Jewish population. This message, this declaration was agreed by unanimity of the 28 member states. So it's a very strong statement. It was not easy to negotiate because there are many different ways of tackling this issue. But I think, as was said by Oded, it's a very useful and strong basis for future work, and it really addresses the different issues that need to be done now, and I'll go into it in a moment. Because anti-Semitism is not a responsibility for the Jews, and also it's only an expression of the fact that something else in democracy is going wrong. I think there is an increasing awareness also from the side of the political leaders. And in fact, if you look into the European election campaign, and you know we will have elections in May to the European Parliament, the two Spitzenkandidaten that are very visible at the moment from the European People's Party, Manfred Weber, has said, if I become president of the European Commission, we will take strong actions against anti-Semitism. And First Vice President Timmermans of the European Commission, who is the Spitzenkandidat for the Social Democrats, visited Auschwitz in January also as a statement to show his support to the Jewish community. And also, in addition to the political leadership, general society is increasingly perceiving anti-Semitism as a problem, and that is something that is changing in a way. So we did a second poll where we polled 27,000 Europeans across the EU as to their perception of anti-Semitism, and 50% say anti-Semitism is a problem in my country, and that is not as high as the Jewish community perceives it, where it's 85%, but it is significant. And I think that it's also a good basis for political action. If 50% say this is a problem, then we have a good, solid basis for political action. There are big differences. Sorry, I have an echo in this microphone. There are big differences between the member states. So, for example, the 3 countries in which this problem is perceived strongest is 81% in Sweden, 72% in France, and 66% in Germany. And then we see that as to the increase of anti-Semitism, 1/3 perceives an increase. Again, the countries are Sweden the highest, 73%, Germany 61%, and the Netherlands 55%. So it's important to note that although there is a difference in perception, and it is natural because of course the community perceives it much more direct and much more personal also, that this is perceived by the general public, and that therefore also this declaration was fully in line with the popular will and perception. So, with regards to this declaration, what does it actually say? The member states agree, among other, and I note the most important aspects, to adopt holistic strategies on anti-Semitism within their existing strategies on racism and xenophobia. This is very important because it means that across the board, across ministries, across the various areas, the national authorities will have to act in order to create these national strategies. They basically call upon themselves to endorse the IRA definition. They commit to increase their efforts to ensure the security of Jewish communities and premises and provide the financing to it. To promote Holocaust education as well as the role of Jewish communities in Europe. And to include these issues also into integration courses. And finally, a big chunk is hate speech online. Maybe a word on this. We have already, as a, let's say, immediate measure in 2016, introduced a code of conduct where we agreed with the big IT companies, and by now many more have joined, but back then it was Facebook, Twitter, Google, Microsoft, to take down within 24 hours hate speech that is illegal according to European legislation when it is flagged to them. So, of course, there is this aspect of flagging, and only a very small portion of illegal hate speech is actually flagged. But we have seen a lot of progress when it comes to the actual takedown rates. It was 28 when we started, so 28 of flagged content was actually taken down, and now we are at almost 80%, so within 2.5 years. So there is progress for content that is notified. And finally, a declaration is only a declaration, but we now need action. The aim is to see tangible change among the Jewish communities, for the Jewish communities, so that when we have another survey on the perception of anti-Semitism among the Jewish community, let's say 5-6 years down the road, that we can see there is a change in trend. This means that Jews see their future more in Europe, that they feel less harassed, that they feel more secure. In order to achieve that, Commissioner Jourova, Commissioner responsible for Justice and Home Affairs, to who I report, created in January this year a working group with the member states where we will bring together all the member states and discuss the individual issues. So security, we are of the opinion that it is necessary, and we are now collecting with the Jewish community the actual situation, whether there has been a risk analysis together with the police. Are there measures being taken? Who is paying for these measures? We think that the security of the Jewish community, just like for any other citizen, is the responsibility of each state, and that therefore also the financing should not be dumped on the communities. So we will have a specific session now starting in June to look with the member states into these aspects, and then they take what is necessary in their country and put that into the national strategy. Because you may know that security, police, but also education are responsibility of the member state. So it's not the Commission who says, you do this now and you do that. It's for the member states to take ownership and also to see what is necessary in their own political system. We will do then the same for the whole area of education, including also integration courses. This means that we don't look in our curricula, as it is currently often the case, unfortunately, only at the points where Jews are either victims or perceived as having a negative influence, either the Shoah or the Middle East conflict, but that we look at the rich period of Jewish life throughout history in Europe, also at the life of Jewish communities in Europe today. And I think, first of all, it is then easier to understand what the Shoah really meant for Europe as an interruption of culture, as a destruction of a whole culture, and what it also means today when anti-Semitism is rising again. This needs to be translated into, the whole range, from textbooks to curricula to training of teachers. The IRA definition will be very helpful, also to raise awareness about how anti-Semitism is expressed today, because we have seen situations where in schools, when Jewish students are being harassed, the headmaster says, well, there is a Middle East conflict going on. No wonder this is playing out here. So the justification of violence in Europe with pointing to a conflict somewhere else in the world, we would not allow that in any other situation. So that's for the area of education, and then one has to see also how this can figure in integration courses, knowing that the acceptance of Jewish life is part of our societies and is the door opener also for newcomers to our societies. It's essential to understand that this is a non-negotiable aspect. As a third aspect, we will discuss the whole area of the IRA definition, how it is being used already. We see an increasing number of member states adopting it. Most recently, France has announced the adoption. It is being used in different ways, different circumstances in member states, different ministries. Some use it for training the police, others use it already in the education area. Universities have adopted it, parties. So there is a very broad range, and we want to see with member states what is feasible, where we can be helpful also, and how this definition can not just remain on paper, but really be used in the public discourse. Maybe one important aspect, it's a non-legally binding definition. And if you look at the text, it makes sense that it is non-legally binding because it's not a legal text. It is important because in its examples, it notes the various forms of also modern anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. And in that, it is a useful tool in the public discourse for media, for NGOs and obviously also public authorities. But it is not a tool that is being used at court. It can help judges and the police to understand if an incident was anti-Semitic, but it's not in itself a legal provision or a legal text. And the final aspect then will be to ensure that all member states will have these national strategies, and that the national strategies will cover all the aspects in the declaration. There are copies outside, so I think it is worth looking at it. It's only 3 pages, so you can quickly read through it, and you will get an idea of what we are up to in the next years in order to ensure, and I think that's also important, with all the security and all the necessary measures that we need at the moment, that eventually we arrive at normality for Jewish people in Europe. That the Jews, just like anybody else, can take their decisions in life not based on security, not based on a question of whether they can live their identity or not, but that they can take these decisions just simply as to their preferences as would anybody else. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. von Schnurbien. I will come with questions after the first round. Ambassador White.
Thank you. Well, thank you, first of all, for having me here to this important discussion. Some words from my side. When the new Austrian government was elected and formed at the end of 2017, a lot of eyes turned to Austria. The question was, okay, so now we have a government that includes a Freedom Party, a party that is clearly to the right of center. What will that mean for Austria? What will that mean for Austrian politics? After all, Austria had, in April 2017, only adopted the IHRA definition for anti-Semitism. So is this now a government that will walk back commitments like this international commitment? Also, 2018, the year that was to come, was for Austria a very important historic year. After all, the Anschluss took place in 1938, so it was the 80th year of commemorating the Anschluss. So how would such a government deal with such an important commemorative year? Not all of you will be experts in Austrian history, but you may know that for a long time after the end of World War II, Austria felt quite comfortable as the first victim. After all, it was a definition used by the Allies. Austria was the first victim, and that was quite a comfortable position to be in. However, in the last 20, 30 years, there was quite a reinterpretation taking place in Austria, and there was a realization that Austria had quite some guilt in this whole process, and it was not good enough to hide behind a victim definition. But again, there was the question, so how would a new government with a party right of center perceive its own history? Will they be trying to walk this back? Actually, in the government declaration that was negotiated between the two parties and adopted, a number of issues were included. The fight against anti-Semitism was declared as a priority of the Austrian government. So they wanted to make very clear that this is something they definitely are very clear on. It talked about Austrian commemoration, about the year of the Anschluss. It talked about the guilt of Austria. It talked about a house of history that was to be created. There is no Austrian museum about Austria's modern history. There are a lot of museums in Austria about art and culture and so on, but not a museum about Austria modern history. The government committed to create such a museum, which will force the government again to look into its own history. So the government made it very clear where it stands on these issues. And also Austria knew that in 2018 we would have, as you described it, we would take on the chair of the presidency of the European Union in the second half of 2018. Given the commitments that I mentioned, it was quite obvious for the Austrian government that they would want to take on this issue and bring it as an issue to a European level. It was a priority for the Austrian presidency. We now get the credit for having adopted it, but we were actually helped out by the schedule of events. You mentioned the word chutzpah, and that's very true. I heard it from Austrian members of the Austrian Jewish community, from Austrian journalists who said, you know, in the past, I would receive emails or messages, and they would all be anonymous, and they would be accused of God knows what. Nowadays, not anonymous anymore. They will write their name, they will write their address, and they're not ashamed to be blatantly anti-Semitic. So the time, in a way, was very ripe in Europe to take this on a European level. As an audience, you might ask yourself, because you said it was not so easy to adopt this resolution, you might ask yourself, why was that complicated? Isn't that the most obvious thing that Europe should do? Well, interestingly enough, it had not been done on the European level. Of course, European member states on the national level are committed to fighting anti-Semitism. I think European countries are very aware that this is not a Jewish problem, it's a problem for our own societies. But it hadn't been done on a European level, so that was the one thing that was important. Also, sometimes things that are obvious still have to be said. And I think it is very important that Europe says, we are on your side. We see this as our clear problem. And this was for us important that really it is said with one European voice. Also in the declaration, it talks about the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. Well, not all European countries have adopted this definition, so it takes some effort and some negotiation to agree upon a text where a definition is mentioned that not all countries have agreed to. But it was possible to agree in a way and in a form that also the countries who had not yet and have not yet described to it could still live with it being mentioned in a document. And lastly, Europe being Europe, that means we are sometimes complicated. Council conclusions are a piece of diplomatic work. It has to go through all ministries, it has to go through drafting sessions, it has to go through headquarters. And for such an exercise, 6 months is actually a short amount of time. This is Europe being Europe. So, as I say, it shows to me, it shows that our government took their commitment that they have written in their government declaration, and as we all know, paper is patient. They took it at heart, and they took it to European level. The time was ripe in Europe, and I think it is very clear where Europe stands. And you've said it, I think, in this definition, in this latest poll. It is quite interesting to see members of the Jewish community say at a level of 90% that their situation has deteriorated, and to see a wider European public saying at a level of some 36% that, yeah, it might have deteriorated. So there are different perceptions, but I think we are very aware of where we are, why this is an issue for all of us. I'm very happy that we achieved this European consensus, and while it might have been complicated, at the substance and at the bottom of it, it wasn't hard at all. I think Europe speaks very clearly with one voice, and Austria was just one of the 28, no more and no less. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Wiess. Dina,
Okay.
Professor Porat, please.
Dina is enough. I'm a little lady, and with age, I'm even smaller. So, if that's okay with you, I'll stand up. Thank you for having me. Thank you for, I'm honored to be in such a distinguished company. Ambassadors that we know, friends, Professor Bauer, as we say, Moreinu V'Rabbeinu, should be definitely, his presence should be definitely mentioned. And I'd like to tell you a small anecdote. I'll come back, of course, to the working definition. In Bucharest, in May 2016, we celebrated your 90th birthday. And on that occasion, we rearranged the IHRA definition. It should be said, with the enormous determined leadership of Ambassador Constantinescu, who passed away recently, and we mourn his passing away, and thank him for the leadership that brought about this adoption of the working definition. It should be said. Okay, I have 2 or 3 points. One is that I feel that there is a discrepancy. There is a problem. And the problem is the following. On the one hand, we cannot complain that governments, leaders are not doing and are not responding to anti-Semitism. There was a host of conferences. And Austria should, I think, be commended. It wasn't just one of 28. In February, just a year ago, there was a huge conference, an academic and leadership, huge conference, about 150 presentations in Vienna. It was followed in November by a conference of the EU, and then Chancellor Kurz had another conference attached to it, and then came the EU declaration. It's a chain. And now the Romanian presidency, they just started 1st of January, but on February 7, they already had a conference on anti-Semitism. there were, just to mention a few more, there were leaders coming up with statements against it, forcefully, like Angela Merkel, like Theresa May, who was the first to adopt in a very determined public speech the IRA definition. President Macron, and before him, Emmanuel Valls. There were protests, demonstrations, at the head of which leaders, local leaders, were marching. So anti-Semitism has become a problem that is not anymore on the fringes of the problems or of the mainstream. It is on the table, on the center of the international table. There are budgets for security, there are budgets for, there are 800 places in France only, Jewish places, are being secured by army and police. Think about the budget, think about the manpower. There are efforts, no doubt. But my question is, this has been happening during the recent number of years. While this was going on, and all these countries and leaders should be definitely commended, anti-Semitism is on the rise. So there is an obvious discrepancy between the efforts and the results. And my question is, where do we pinpoint the problem? If there are efforts, and there are, why is anti-Semitism on the rise? And if I may offer, and the word chutzpah has already been used, so I'll go along with it. If it's not a chutzpah on my side to offer a thought, because the discrepancy is obvious. I think that these efforts from above do not meet the lower levels of society, or the lower, I think lower is not a kind word, but the public levels, not only extreme left, extreme right, radical Islamists. Okay, they don't listen, we can understand. But local population, or the fringes of the extremists. And here indeed, the social nets are part of this public problem, because any piece of news, I don't have to tell you, any piece of news, any insult is distributed and multiplied by the hundreds of thousands in half a minute, okay? And so it echoes, the events echo a lot more. Therefore, I think these are like two lines that do not meet yet. The efforts from above and local society, education, social nets, etc. And this is the challenge, perhaps. This is the challenge, to make these two meet. Otherwise, we go on with the discrepancy. Okay, that was my first point. I hope I didn't, it wasn't too hard on you. The second one, I'll take up again the point, Katharina, that you mentioned. I allow myself to call you Katharina. We know each other for many years. The working definition is not legally binding. And I'm sorry that Mr. Herzog is gone, because he spoke about it and said legal. He said that's a legal document and it should be put into the legal systems. I agree with you that the power of the working definition is that it is not legally binding, because just think about the other possibility. Let's say it would be or has been adopted with a legal restriction, saying, Kinderlach, this is the definition, now whoever does anything against what is written in it should be taken to court. It's it's not a good idea. It's not a good idea at all. It is a way to deter. It is a way to create objection. It is enough that there is a working definition only for the Jewish, for anti-Semitism, for the Jewish people, and not for others. There are attempts to determine what is anti-Tzigganism, what is Islamophobia, but they are not as forceful or as distributed as the working definition. So I think it should stay non-legal. It should stay an adoption, a recommendation, a document that you can work with. You can complain and go to court with it, and then the court would decide, which is done in some cases. You can train policemen. You can teach. But I think that definitely, definitely, it should not be legally binding because it really would go against freedom of speech. It will cause resentment, and it will cause resentment, more resentment, against the 4 items. There are 7 items in the definition that say what are the examples of anti-Semitism, and 4 when anti-Zionism is, okay, when anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. It will cause more resentment because it will say it's not only against the freedom of speech, it's against any possibility to criticize the state of Israel. Therefore, the definition says clearly, criticism, legal, normal criticism of the state of Israel is not considered anti-Semitism. It is only when it is said and expressed with anti-Semitic tone and symbols. Okay. Let me finish by a third point. And the third point is the following. Oded, when you sent us the questions, one of them was, and perhaps you will ask me later again, one of the questions to me was, what is missing in the declaration? As we say in Yiddish, the kale is too shame. It is such a good declaration. What is missing? But I still would add, now I will add one point and perhaps another one later. You told us about Timmermans going to Auschwitz in order to show support and sympathy to the Jewish people. I would say that perhaps if we can add, okay, to this declaration and to education, not only teaching about the Holocaust, and not only teaching about anti-Semitism, and when this and that is anti-Semitism, and not only visits to Auschwitz. This is not enough to express or to describe Jewish identity, Jewish culture, Jewish contribution in all aspects of life to Europe. I would love to see, in another world perhaps, I would love to see in classes, in European schools, where they have Christian and Muslim and Jewish pupils studying together, that studies about each other, coming to know each other religion. They don't know. There is rampant ignorance. Ask a Jewish pupil what is Christendom, what is the Muslim religion, and vice versa. I would love to see not only the negative aspects, the Holocaust, anti-Semitism, etc., but a study of each other's contribution, values, culture, and perhaps, amen.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor Porat. Your turn, Ambassador Giaufret.
Thank you. It's very difficult to follow Dina Porat, so I'll try to say something that is interesting. I like to start from the beginning, because you both, Maya and you, Oded, said this is the first time the Israeli Association for the Study of European Integration is looking into the issue of anti-Semitism. But I think it's very pertinent. I think you're doing the right thing, because if we look at the European Union and we try to give an answer, what is the European Union, why is it there? Why was it created? Well, it was created because of the Second World War and the Shoah. I think this was a reaction to the horrors of the war that afflicted the Jewish people in Europe and the Europeans. It was the answer. It was to create a different type of model of society that would bring through rules, respect for human rights, fundamental freedoms, tolerance, the right to live together in prosperity. And I like to quote the High Representative Federica Mogherini, that she's made a statement for the International Day for Holocaust Remembrance. And she said, anti-Semitism is an attack against the very foundations of our European Union. It's an attack against all of us. So when we say anti-Semitism and the EU, there's a very, very close link. And the fact that we are here discussing this is because the solution that was proposed in the 50s after the horrors of the Second World War is again on the table. And I don't know whether Steve Bannon gave us the right explanations for this, but certainly we are seeing a return of habits, of violations of fundamental rights, of anti-Semitism that we hadn't seen for many years. So we do have a problem. I agree with what Dina Porat said, that there is a mobilization at the highest level. Certainly within the European Union, President Juncker, Vice President Timmermans, Commissioner for Justice Jourova, the High Representative Mogherini, and the President of the Parliament, Tajani, they very committed, like are many European leaders, and certainly the Austrian presidency showed us its commitment. There is a mobilization. I think this is what makes things different from what we've seen in other set period of history. So we have a reaction, and at the European Union level, we need to do what is helpful to do, what can work, and what can make a difference. Actually, we do have legislation at European Union level that was adopted 2009-8. So we have a framework decision that has criminalized the denial and trivialization of the Holocaust and incitement leading to violence, including anti-Semitic incitement. And actually, the declaration that we're discussing today is calling member states to adequately and properly implement that legislation. So we have tools that we had adopted many years ago that we need to now make sure that they work and are implemented correctly. The code of conduct for social media that Katharina has mentioned, and Ms. Porat has, I think, put a finger in the social media, clearly something that tend to amplify the phenomenon and make it much more harmful. The European Union can do things that member states cannot do, because if you sit down with Facebook or Twitter or YouTube, you need to have the capacity to force them to take certain decisions that are maybe commercially not viable, not interesting. In order to have the force to make these changes, you need to have the power to do that. And the European Union, with 500 million consumers, the largest internal market in the world, has the capacity to sit down with this company and try to change things. So the code of conduct has been there for a couple of years now. We've seen already some improvement. There is a debate, well, this is enough, we need to do more. I think a debate will continue, and depending on how this debate will go, we'll take decision. But I think that's certainly something that the European Union has done and can do. Education, I think we've heard it as a key aspect. Member states obviously have the lead in the education, but we can, of course, provide a framework under which this is done, and the declaration, we discussed it. And then I think it's the political momentum that is very important. we have now seen a mobilization of leadership, but the problem continues. I think it's certainly, there's always sometimes a gap between a problem that starts and grows, the realization and the need to oppose it. I think what is important is to keep the political momentum here. And the fact that the Romanian presidency has started its presidency with a conference on anti-Semitism was important precisely because to show that the adoption of the declaration in December was not just an episode, but was part of a wider, a much longer strategy. I think we must think that we're here for the long run. I mean, this is something that will not be solved tomorrow. I think it's going to take time. And we need to remain mobilized on this aspect. We need to mobilize, and therefore we need that our leaders, our political leaders, and the bureaucratic system remain mobilized. So I think it's positive. It's very important that those that are now running to lead the European Union of tomorrow have made of the fight against anti-Semitism an important issue of their campaign, because they will keep it very much high on the political agenda. And then I think what we need to do is to make sure that we go back to basic human rights. I think here we need to remember that the European Union was created precisely, as I said at the beginning, to ensure the rights of the citizens, the rights to life, the rights, the freedom of assembly, freedom of association, freedom of expression, the freedom to profess your own religion, your own cultural tradition, free of violence, free of threat. And this is what we need to do. I think it's a context. I think anti-Semitism is often a symptom of something that maybe go beyond that. And we need to make sure that our respect for the international law, for human rights, and we need to do it daily. And I think the rights of the Jewish community, the Jewish citizens of Europe, need to be upheld, because why we're upholding those rights, we're upholding the rights of everyone. And of course, we need to look also at the broader picture, because we have other phenomena in Europe that are worrying, and other community under threat. And then finally, and I close this as I'm the ambassador of the European Union to Israel, I think partnership, international partnership, are also very important. I think here with Israel, we need to work together, and we have worked together. And Oded, when you were the Israeli ambassador to Brussels, you remember that one of the deliverables of the action plan in 2005 was to have a seminar on anti-Semitism and xenophobia that we've been having now for about 12 years. And the last one was in December. So we have a partnership with Israel. We even organized a joint event at the United Nations in New York a couple of years ago. And this is a very precious partnership. I think we need to work with you. And I have to say that on this specific topic, in my daily work, with the colleagues in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, with the Jewish Agency, with the various think tanks that exist in Israel that are actually working on anti-Semitism, like the Kantor Center, Yad Vashem, etc. We're working there. And next week with my colleagues, the Ambassador of the European Union, we'll go to Yad Vashem to look at a project that the European Union is funding on the archives of the Holocaust, how we can improve access to documents that can allow us to strengthen the memory of the Holocaust. Thank you.
Many thanks to the panelists. We will start now the second round with questions. And the question to you, Ms. von Schnurbien, for another couple of weeks, the EU is 28 states. How difficult was it, the process to get the acceptance, the agreement of all the member states, and without naming countries specifically, what was the opposition, if there was an opposition to certain elements in the declaration? Well,
I already said that the situation in member states is very different. We know that also anti-Semitism is expressed in very different ways, for example, between Western Europe and Eastern Europe. I think that, and as was said by Ambassador Wiess, this was for the first time this was being discussed in such a context on European level. Therefore, member states came from very different angles, and I think this was maybe the main challenge. I can't finger point there particular, but maybe the original challenge and that showed the different approaches was to say, do we do a declaration only on anti-Semitism, or is it a declaration on racism, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, and all other forms of intolerance? And the Austrian presidency and also the Commission and many other member states were of the opinion that it should be specifically on anti-Semitism, as we discuss, in the context of a general strategy on racism and xenophobia. And we just do this in other areas as well. We discuss in the context of migration, for example, the unaccompanied minors. So it is normal that you have, in a larger context, specific declarations. And in that same way, I think it was important to say, in the general context, we discuss this time specifically anti-Semitism.
In the various discussions, was there some sort of ambivalence or a mixture of the anti-Israeli elements, because we know that certain countries are more critical than others of the Israeli behavior on human rights, etc. Was there sort of a part of a discussion, or was it totally on the Jewish anti-Semitic xenophobia and racism?
This was a declaration really on anti-Semitism in Europe. So this is what we discussed. Also, you know the system very well. You have certain council formations, and this council formation was interior, so there was no discussion whatsoever on external issues.
Dr. Ambassador Wiess, did the Israelis in your daily work express any interest in this declaration and the deliberation? Was it any serious or significant subject in your work?
This was a debate that was really led in Europe. That was a very European debate. Once the declaration was adopted, it was certainly noted in Israel. There were commentaries in newspapers. We got some letters. We had contact with civil society, and it was noted that this decision was taken on a European level. So the Israeli Foreign Ministry welcomed it and spoke about a breakthrough. So it was seen. It came to the level of public attention, but it was a European debate that was led. And yes, it had some repercussions, positive ones in Israel for our work.
Dina, Porat, this is a very diplomatic answer, I think, from Ambassador Wiess. What do you think about Israeli formal and civil society reaction, if there's any, to the declaration?
I think the answer was there. It was reported on. It was definitely welcome. I think it was even declared or defined as a historic declaration.
Defined by whom?
In the press. We have here, by the way, Mr. Ran Yacobi the head of the department that struggles against anti-Semitism in our foreign ministry. So I would say that I hope he agrees that there was satisfaction, that this is a good declaration. And now the question is, of course, and perhaps this is part of the reaction, the question was how this good declaration is going to be implemented. Okay? On interviews, I think a point was made that the declaration includes a very significant expression. And the expression is not Jews or Jewish communities. It says in the declaration, Jewish Europeans. And it's the first time I see this expression in an international document. Not Jews, not Jewish communities, but Jewish Europeans, which means that first of all, the Jews are Europeans. They are of a certain religion, entity, ethnicity, but it's hard to define Jews, but it is first, they are first of all Europeans. So all this was definitely accepted with satisfaction, but also with a question mark, how this is going to be implemented.
Ambassador Giaufret, on the big picture of the Israeli-EU relations, and this is a very complicated agenda, we have the economic, the scientific cooperation, then we have our differences, political differences. On the big sort of picture of the relations, how important is this declaration?
I think it's important in the sense that it's part of a larger picture on our common fight against anti-Semitism. I think it's a concrete manifestation of the political determination of Europe to take steps. Of course, it's a question of how we implement it. I'm sure that everyone is going to look very carefully, and this is where the political momentum is important for the future. But it is, I think there is this is the way I perceive it. There is and today we had the pleasure of sharing the table with a minister, and we discussed so many things. And we also discussed about this specific issue, and I think there is a sense on the government side, and that there is a determination to work. So I think it's important. It is important because it's an area where despite we cannot be satisfied. Absolutely not. We cannot be satisfied because we have a problem at hand which is very, very serious. But this is we are working together. I think there is an understanding that we see things in a very similar way. So I think it's a positive, certainly a positive thing. But it's part of a whole and part of something we started before with the seminars on anti-Semitism. The fact that every year we sit down in Brussels, once in Jerusalem, to discuss together the fight against anti-Semitism. And now the problem has become larger and more serious, and we need to step up the response. And this, I think, is understood, and we certainly look forward to continue working with the Israeli government in different areas, but certainly on this too.
I have a very undiplomatic question to you, and I don't know how you're going to deal with it. We have a government in Israel, and I'm not critical, but we have a government which is preferring, for obvious reasons, to deal with certain member states of the Union, namely East European countries. Yet these, not all of them, in some of the member states, you have in power parties which are not necessarily living in peace with the declaration, or, as I said in the opening remarks, espouse certain ideologies, views that are not corresponding with the aims and the language of this declaration. How do you view that? You are the EU ambassador to Israel, the last I heard.
Obviously, Israel I think Israel has a good relationship with all member states, and some are more intense than others. But we see many countries coming here. I think there's visits from everywhere. We'll have Cyprus and Greece coming again in a few days to Israel. So I think it's wider than that, and this is the government decides how to conduct its bilateral relationship with the member states as it sees fit. And this is a decision that is taken by the Israeli government, and they are responsible for those decisions, and they conducting them in the way they think is right. From my perspective, it's rather I'm so particularly paid to foster the relation with between the EU and Israel, and this is what I want to do. And I think here we certainly have margin of maneuver, margin of improvement, but I think what we're discussing today is again a highlight how important is the relationship between Israel and the European Union as a whole. Because everything we discussed, we've done it at the EU level. The political momentum, and member states have given a tremendous contribution. Individual member states have given a tremendous contribution. But at the end of the day, there are things they can do only when the EU is following. Now we have this declaration. We will have to implement in all member states. We have an instrument, the code of conduct for the social media, the framework decision that imposed each member state to transpose the criminalization of the denial of the Holocaust, the fact that we remain committed to the values of tolerance and human rights for our own Jewish citizens as for everyone, this to me is something that goes beyond the economic interest that we certainly have together. And this is why it's important that beyond the relationship with the individual member states that are important and are normal, and we're very happy that they did prosper, but also at the European level.
Thank you, Emmanuele. To Ms. Schnurbien, you spoke about the national strategy. How do you bring about the harmonization of the various action that will follow by member states? What is the mechanism by which you see that countries from Greece in the east to somewhere in the Baltic have a common language, a common terminology, the same attitude to various aspects, legal, security, freedom of speech, etc., that they are all harmonized into the same language?
It's an understandable question, but it's probably not the aim to harmonize everything in this process. So if you ask about the mechanisms, we already have with the member states a high-level group on racism and xenophobia, where we will have now as a subgroup this member states group on the implementation of this declaration, where we will discuss all these different aspects. But as I said before, the different policy areas to a large extent are competence of the member states, and they are competence of the member states because member states in these areas are very different. So they come with a different history, with different ways of teaching, different structures, different backgrounds, and I think this has been the strength of the EU to recognize this diversity.
Forgive me for interrupting.
Yeah.
You may end up with a situation that for a similar offense, you will get 6 months imprisonment in one country and 2 months in a different member state. Can it be?
Well, this is how the EU works in this way. Yeah? The member states have their own legal systems. There are European standards that are translated. Member states also, by the way, have, and with regards to the framework decisions, some have decided to do so, to implement higher standards than is the minimum standard on EU level. But I think what is also important to say is that, and I fully agree with Dina with these two tracks, the political level that is very active and the popular public opinion that has not yet been reached. This, I think, can be changed if we allow declination down into the different structures. This means that, for example, in Germany, it's not only that we have now a special envoy on anti-Semitism on national level. Several German Länder have also nominated special envoys because the responsibility of education and security in Germany is a Länder responsibility. That means that if on that level now they will start talking to their the Council of School Directors, the unions, the churches, the different aspects, then the police, the judges. So if we decline it down like that, and this is, I think, what will happen as a mechanism, as a process, it will allow to ensure that the diversity and the specific structures of member states are being kept, while the general aim is there to fight anti-Semitism in all its forms. I know it's a complicated system, but this is how we work.
But
Ambassador Wiess, you want to do it?
Yeah, just everyone has their own history, so everyone comes to this from their own background. Austria, given our own history, has a very strict law on Wiederbetätigung. So this is, when you walk down an Austrian street and you have a swastika on your arm, this is a criminal offense. This will bring you to jail. If you do the same thing in the United States, this is freedom of expression. So everyone has the same background, and it's the same thing in Europe. It will not be a criminal offense in every European country, but everyone has their background, and it's also the beauty of Europe, the strength in diversity.
In the last minutes of this panel, very short answers to the question posed by Dina Porat. And let me remind you, the question was, how come there is a wide gap between the very commendable activities of the EU on the level of governments, the collective level, declarations, seminars, other actions against or combating anti-Semitism, and yet when you look at the statistics, there is a significant rise of anti-Semitic events, actions. How do you explain it?
Well, I think there is this discrepancy comes, I mean, with a lot of other aspects that we have also touched upon here. The rise of populism, the fear of change, the situation that Europe is changing. And when it comes to these challenges, the Jews are often the first victims. And this is what we are also seeing to some extent. So, and then there's another aspect, and I think that is important, and something that I say often in the European to European audience, that Europe is not a hero in civil courage. In our history, we have not stood up necessarily when others saw injustice. And this is something we need to develop, and something to some extent we can probably even learn from the US. Because when anti-Semitic incidents and other incidents happen there, you have a reaction from within civil society. So we need the political leadership, but we also need to create political momentum with the civil society to stand up against these incidents. And that, of course, is in a way also a change in our culture and a big challenge. But it needs to be addressed, and I think one aspect is also to honor those who actually show civil courage.
Ambassador Giaufret?
I think it's very difficult to give you a concrete answer. There is a gap, but we've seen a phenomenon that is becoming more and more evident. The surveys of the Fundamental Rights Agency was published in December. The Eurobarometers was January. So I think you have a stage. The phenomenon, the political leadership decides to take a scientific measure of the phenomenon and taking steps. So we will need to see whether the results are there, but I'm not sure that we'll see immediate results. I don't think we should think that tomorrow we'll see a decrease of anti-Semitic attacks. I think it would be wrong to. I think what we need to do is to keep the political momentum, to keep the focus on this issue. I don't think it's going to be a short period. We will need to remain engaged for a little bit.
Ambassador Wiess?
Well, I think we all thought that we were at a better place. We were, I think, all taken a little bit by surprise how nationalism, anti-Semitism came back with a vengeance on the world front stage. Really, for me, sometimes I cannot believe what I'm seeing. When in 1989 the wall came down and the end of the Soviet Union, we all thought, the end of history, brotherhood and apple pie for everyone. And now we have a very, very different landscape. But I think we are reacting to it. We all realize that this is not a one-off. This is not like, okay, the Americans have developed a global positioning system, now the European Union needs Galileo, and then it's done. We know that this is a process. We know that action is needed right now. And I think we're all very ready to act. And I am very happy about the momentum that I see on a European level.
Dina, Porat, you have the last word to answer your own question, please.
No. I'm not sure I have an answer. As I said, there is a gap, and there is this challenge to bridge over the gap. But with your permission, you always say with your permission, and then you do what you are not permitted. I would like to end with one more point that has not been mentioned yet. We spoke about the declaration. We spoke about how should it be implemented. What should Europe do? I would also like to add one point the Jewish organizations and institutes should do. And this is to coordinate better among themselves the fight against anti-Semitism. Because wherever you look, there is a new center or a new department or new this and new that against anti-Semitism.
I was going to say to you, this is an unrealistic request.
Yeah, I know. If I may tell you an anecdote, the present Pope is from Buenos Aires. I was also born in Buenos Aires, and we have a common friend. His best friend, they speak twice a week, is a rabbi, Rabbi Avraham Skorka, whom I also know very well. And so I know from him that the Pope says more or less the following. Monday, Camp Bnei Brit. Thursday, American Jewish Committee. Next Monday, World Jewish Congress. Next Thursday, I don't remember. So even if this is not realistic, and indeed the poet Abba Kovner said, המחלוקת אבן פינה בתרבות ישראל. The dispute is a cornerstone in Jewish culture. we always dispute. This is our power and this is our charm, let's say. Weakness, I don't know. Always many opinions. But at least, let's say, now Katharina tells us that there will be a committee, okay? An action committee made of the representatives of these 28 countries. Okay, can we perhaps expect that there would be some cooperation among Jewish major institutes, among major communities, going up to this committee and dealing with them? And Oded, I know you are a very realistic diplomat, but Katharina hands me an action plan for combating anti-Semitism in Europe, and it was presented by American Jewish Committee, B'nai Brit, EJC, and World Jewish Congress. So they can do something together. Okay?
I hope there is no dispute in asking everyone to applaud the panel, and thank you very much.